All right, so it's 9 o'clock on the dot. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Perfect.
I can hear you.
Okay, so we see participants coming in. So hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'd like to welcome all of you to today's Digital Identity Report pre-launch event, where we're going to have a unique opportunity to get a high-level preview of the latest report being launched by Mobiforum, titled "The Rise of Digital Identity Wallets, Will Banks Be Left Behind?" And what's better, as part of this event, you'll have the unique opportunity to connect with the authors of the report to ask your questions and get some valuable insights. So go ahead and click that chat button and send your questions our way so that we can answer them with our expert group here today. I'd also like to remind everyone on the call here that a copy of the report will be distributed to you after the discussion to provide you exclusive access to the insights ahead of the rest of the industry. So without further ado, I'd like to quickly introduce myself. My name is Ruben Jacob, and I am the report executive, and I'm currently working with TD Bank Canada. And today with us, we also have our thought leaders and digital identity expert group chairs, Jukka Lintinen from G+D Finland and Kevin Farragher from Interact Canada. Thank you so much, Kevin and Jukka, for joining us today.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Thank you. Yes, great pleasure to be here, Ruben.
Perfect. So we have little time and so much to discuss, so I'll get straight to it. So we've got a great array of questions to you that we have to ask you about the report. And the first question I'd like to ask Kevin is for you, because it's specifically about banks. The digital identity management market is expected to grow up to about $70 billion by 2030. And we've seen significant activity in this space from banks, fintechs, big techs, and even startups. And banks in particular have been closely following the latest developments in this space, and they're envisioning how exactly they fit into this digital identity ecosystem and what role they can play as banks to add more value to customers' lives and stay more relevant in customers' lives. Could you tell us what this report aims to inform banks about, and why should banks pay attention to what's happening in the digital identity space?
Sure. So the report obviously goes into a lot of detail. It's the main objective of the report to cover this topic, but just I think I'll give some high-level thoughts from the bank perspective, starting with the fundamental issue, which is there is a trust gap on the internet. So we this layer of trust in the internet has never really been built, and we come up with all sorts of kludgy, interesting ways to solve for that. I think if you think about what banks do and what they've done for hundreds of years, maybe more, is provide a trust service. So banks have always been at the center or brokering of trust. And I think there's an opportunity in the digital space for the banks to fill that need, that gap, to really empower the digital economy to move forward, and to ensure that banks or financial institutions are part of the digital economy and not left behind by the more innovative, newer powerhouses in the world in big tech. And I think there's a few things that banks have today that make them very applicable to solve this problem. One, all banks have now become digital banks. There's very few successful banks who don't have pretty excellent online offerings. And one of the big things, at least in most developed markets, is banks have extremely good authentication, data privacy practices. They are regulated entities that have to do know your customer and face big implications if they've not done the required anti-money laundering, know your customer kind of requirements. So you've got best-in-class authentication, regulated body. They care a great deal about privacy and data protection, and then and lastly, they have high customer engagement. So customers know they use their bank quite often digitally, and so if you take those things that banks are already doing and make them available to third parties in a trusted, protected, private way, you have the ability to unlock value for the consumer, and then the banks can play a bit of a toll booth, have a bit of a toll booth role, and potentially generate revenue. from that service that they're providing. I think on the other side is banks have a pretty great opportunity to be the recipient of trusted digital identity in order to reduce fraud, improve their onboarding processes for new customers, and potentially participate in open banking type scenarios where they can add value to their customer base.
Right, that's a great point, Kevin. And as you said, banks can really leverage in their position of trust, and they also have those best-in-class security systems available, and use that to leverage their position as being trusted custodians of customers' information, and to set up and play a prominent role in the digital identity space. You guys, wondering if you had anything to add to what Kevin was saying?
Well, nothing much. I think it was very comprehensive. Well, maybe one of the, as the title also says, is that the time has come. I mean, it's now that the different parties need to act, including the banks, because like Kevin said, there are regulations, so they are being updated, strengthened, like in many geographies at the moment, and the guidelines. But also the technology and the standards, they have evolved a lot. So there is a certain maturity which kind of gives a basis for building a trusted digital identity systems, which can be also user-friendly. So I think that's very important to know. And then, of course, the other thing is that there is still growing need for the people, I mean, private users or citizens, but especially also for businesses to have a strong digital identity. And especially in that sector, banks have probably a lot of room to play.
Perfect. And that sort of leads me to my next question, because as financial institutions, governments, and other businesses explore more ways to sort of build trust in the digital economy while still being customer-centric, digital identity wallets are becoming a topic of increasing interest. So it really comes as no surprise that the report really shines that spotlight on digital identity wallets. So my question to you is why did you decide to delve deep into this topic? And also tell us more about how the report approaches this complex and fast evolving world of digital identity wallets.
Well,
you can go ahead, yeah.
I can take the first shot. So, well, like you said it, Ruben, so digital identity is not a kind of an easy topic. So because there is a lot of regulation, technology, relationship between the parties, including, for example, where the liability lies. So that if there is some sort of a breach or incident, so who is responsible that it was really authentic identification. So this all happens behind kind of the scenes, and finally the wallet is the visual element of the digital identity. And that holds true whether this is a private citizens or businesses. And by the way, the digital identity wallet, this is a little bit, of course, the kind of a difficult topic or the concept. What does that mean? And we have our definition. I think that there are many other definitions, but we basically define that it can be an app in a mobile wallet, but it can be also browser access and so forth, because organizations needs to have the digital identity, and it cannot be just related to a particular, for example, mobile phone. So, and then any service is finally dependent on how easy you can access and use this kind of a digital identity or service, and then this applies really also to the digital identity. So I think these are some of the reasons why wallet became to the theme of the report. And if you look also at the market in general, so many players outside the banking community, they have put their wallets into the market, not necessarily originally on the identity. They could be in the payment, they could be different kind of a loyalty or actually shopping experience. But then actually identity is the core thing also for these wallets. So these are at least some of the things that we thought that the wallet would be the good common denominator for the report.
Kevin, would you like to add anything? Yeah, go ahead.
I agree. Like wallet is a perfect analogy for, you know, the digital representation of the analog thing we keep in our pockets. And so it's just, it's a bit of a challenging conversation or word, because it is used to mean many different things. And like Yuka said, it's not really about whether it's an identity wallet or a payment wallet or a loyalty wallet. Identity has a role in all of those scenarios and product types. So I think it's just important to think about not just the wallet as being the end the strategy. It's really the use cases that are going to drive the use of the wallet. And so it's an interesting topic, but yeah, it's very commonly used, and we know at Mobi that the wallet is a broad and interesting space, and we're kind of revisiting wallet with a new expert group that we're launching on wallets. And I think it's a bit of a callback to maybe about a decade ago when we had something around wallets. So, you know, the wallet construct is not new, and it serves a lot of purposes to help us talk about digital identity for the layperson.
So you mentioned a great point there, Kevin, because we often hear how when it comes to digital identity, unfortunately, the focus is more on technology rather than the use cases and how it can add value to customers and lives of end users. So what this report does is that it really puts the focus back on those use cases. Can you tell us more about what are some of those new use cases and value streams that banks can unlock with digital identity and digital identity wallets?
Sure. I think from the bank side, banks have a lot to gain from the use of a digital identity service, from primarily onboarding new customers into their organization, and a good digital identity that's well designed and has the right liability models around it, et cetera, would be onboarding and solving the KYC AML problem, which all banks need to do. And so beyond that, there's fraud protection, ensuring new customers are exactly who they say they are, and then offering services around, say, digital signatures or removing paper processes. That all these things can all be enabled through digital identity, and facilitating, enabling embedded finance kind of use cases.
And Yuka, do you what are your thoughts on?
Well,
on that?
Very, very similar, of course. And we also did this survey, and those kind of were some of the use cases, like really onboarding, KYC, AML, were on top of the list. So because they are kind of obvious, and banks need to somehow, do them anyway. I think that the important there is, especially when you look from the bank's point of view, that there is already a kind of a wide array of services that you can do yourself for your own customers. Not to mention that, okay, can you play a role that you provide you are the identity service provider, or you are the wallet provider, which could be then utilized by the others. What we have seen, of course, and there are great members, of course, also in our expert group coming from different countries, and countries where there is quite a mature digital identity scheme. So we have seen that when you get to the first steps, you get actually, I would say, unlimited number of use cases finally. Some of them might be very specific. They could be on the private sector, governmental sector, and so forth. But the big thing probably is that you need to take that first step, and then basically the use case starts to come. Because like any service, digital identity, it's a kind of an enabling service finally, but you need to have this habit behavior that you use it, so that it's frequent enough that the first thing that comes to your mind is that, okay, this is how I do it. So because that gives then the volume finally, which is of course important also for the business case.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that, Kevin and Yuka. Now we are sort of at that half point of this session, so I'd like to encourage everyone to to click that chat button and send your questions your way. I see some hands up, so I'd really appreciate if you could just click that chat button and send our questions. So while you're doing that, I'd just like to carry on from that topic previous question that we just discussed, because the report talks about how we're living in this world where the entire concept of banking and the future of money is being disrupted. So according to you, Yuka and Kevin, how do you feel digital identity can help banks sort of mitigate the risks associated with these disruptive changes? And how can digital identity also help banks meet their strategic objectives?
So I guess I'll start. I think going back to the the original question is what's in it for banks, and it's really, I like to think about building a foundation around the FI's place in the digital economy, in the threat of big tech and Google and Apple Pay. The Apple Wallet is a big part of many people's digital lives today, and banks are not necessarily involved in that customer experience and that value chain. They're a bit put in the back end where their cards are there and they may be used for payments, but they're not really managing or controlling or influencing that user experience. And so in order to stay relevant in the digital economy, I think take advantage of some of the strengths that FIs already have, in market the fact that trust and privacy and protection of customers' data is one of the key tenets of the organization's strategy, and sort of take control of that part of the trust economy. So that's one of the key strategies I think that banks need to start thinking about. And so you would be interested, there would be value. You have a business case around just consuming identity and reducing fraud and getting faster onboarding and having better KYC, but you're really just a passive participant in the trust economy. Whereas I think banks have a leadership position opportunity to say, we are the most trusted gateway into an identity, and part of what what banks are going to have to do is, banks don't necessarily, they're not the issuers of core identity, of course, right? This is governments and jurisdictions, and so ultimately they the public sector owns the citizen's identity, but banks serve as a very strong proxy to that, and by working with public sector and ensuring that their foundational identities are represented in the right way and utilized in the right way, I think there's a good partnership available.
Yes, very much agree. And I mean, because the digital identity is really it's a building block in the digital economy. So, and you need to really, the endpoints need to be strongly identified to create the trust. And I believe that the banks are really in a great position, because that's trust is the banking business. And once you have really created this kind of a ecosystem, then you can build actual services on top of that one. And one what I see is that, like Kevin said, so digital identities, finally the root identity comes from the government, because it needs to be governed by the public sector, but then it can be inherited then, and the banks are really in the great position to service different kind of needs in the business, also in the B2B world, which now might not be, the kind of a main focus from the governmental bodies. Not to mention that the government is maybe not the best party for the business cases, the look, the user journeys, great user experiences, because again, you can have a great technology, regulations, everything in place, you have digital wallets, but if it's an not good user experience, people just don't use it. So we have so many implementations already which are more kind of a maybe technology or regulatory driven, which has then failed.
Perfect. And we've got our first question from Carmen. Thank you so much, Carmen, for your question. Kevin says that it is interesting that you brought up cooperation with the government, and it's also a matter of cross-border cooperation. How would you see this solved involving the financial players?
I'll start. So I think international interoperability is something that we can all see strong value for. I know that the way we're approaching that in Canada is assessing the standards that are have this great promise to be adopted across the globe and interoperable. So something like the W3C verifiable credential, and I'm probably mixing up technical terms a little bit here, but there's a lot of promise on standards, but I've not seen great progress in terms of truly adopting a ubiquitous standard. One of my colleagues has a fun joke. The great thing about standards is there's so many of them to choose from. And I think that's true with the digital identity standards that are working out. So I think we have an idea that international interoperability is really important. We all think that standards-based identity schemes in Canada, in Europe, in the EU, and all these different jurisdictions could build that bridge that allows those different domestic networks to work together. But I think we've got a lot of work to do to get there. But you can see the use cases, right? International travel, immigration, all sorts of interesting things. And there is, I think, just out of interest, if you want to look them up, ID Partners, US company, US startup, they are trying to build a network where, you know, they would work with Bank ID in the Nordics and Interac Identity in Canada and someone else in Singapore and bridge those networks into one internationally available network. But again, lots of work there.
Yes, I agree with Kevin that this cross-border is a well, it's an important topic, and we have been discussing that a lot in the group too. I myself, my own maybe a bit subjective view is that probably it starts growing from the network to network, a bit what Kevin was already saying, that if there is something in Canada, EU is anyway regulating now, they have the eIDAS and the wallet topics. So finally, then these networks need to start talking to each other. There is also industry efforts like GAIN, who exactly looks this, how different networks can be integrated. But then if you look maybe the other part of the question, so how this governmental and let's say the private sector come together. Well, I'm coming from Finland, and here, for example, we have the cooperative Findi by the private sector, and their whole basically proposition is that they rely on the governmental identity, but then they basically build the rule books and the whole ecosystem for the private sector to kind of utilize that identity which is provided, so that the businesses can have a kind of a common framework on top which they can build actually then the identity services. So I think that's a kind of a great way forward, because without that kind of a consensus, it's kind of a single actors trying to solve the problem with where are multiple parties. So I don't think that formula works.
Right, and both of you touched upon some of those, technical standards, some of the models of implementation, and also the regulation, and the report does go into some detail on that. So it gives a holistic view, not just about some of the business insights, but it's also regarding some of the technical insights. And just to talk about some of the other highlights of the report, one of the key highlights is the results of a survey conducted among leading banks across Europe, North America, and Africa. And based on this survey, according to both of you, how are banks thinking about digital identity wallets and their overall digital identity strategy? Kevin, would you like to take that?
Sure, yeah. So banks are thinking generally that they trust other FIs and other government entities in order to participate in the banking space. Most are interested in, like I said, the KYC AML use cases to onboard new customers, and the majority actually say they will issue a digital ID wallet, which is interesting because in many cases, the wallet, in order to get adoption, is going to require some kind of collaboration with other entities. I don't think we're going to end up in a world where, like your banking app, every bank has their own identity wallet app. That just the use of the attractiveness for the market to integrate with a whole bunch of different app wallets is trickier, unless of course it's standards based, and then you've got a better way forward there.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, that a majority of the banks said that they were interested in either issuing their own digital identity wallets, and this was not only by banks who are in Europe, which we could understand was due to eIDAS regulation, but it's also banks outside of Europe, which means that, as the report says, that banks do see genuine value in issuing their digital identity wallets or issuing credentials to third-party wallets. Jukka, what do you think about that?
Well, yeah, I think that that was the result. So, I believe that the banks were also quite open to look different models. So like Kevin said, so many of them said that they are issuing or planning to issue the wallet, but they could also be happy to issue their own credentials to a wallet issued by somebody else, or of course also just kind of a consuming or being a relying party, so consuming the credentials. But I think that one of the fundamentals which is very important for all the banks is that there needs to be liabilities which are related to use of credentials, that they are clearly defined and managed, because otherwise it's kind of almost like an open tap. So that's one of the findings that we had. So and of course then you need to look a little bit the different geographies. So yes, we did have the interview of these 3 continents, and I think it's quite a good coverage. However, I think that the banks are we can conclude, let's say, that the banks are fully aware that what happens there in the market, but still there are different maturity states also if we look globally, and then different markets have chosen also a little bit different kind of approach. So there is probably not just one formula which with what fits to everybody, but what we see is that this collaboration is the key. I think that comes everywhere, wherever we have seen successful implementation or implementations which are now ongoing, or also where the regulations come into the place, it calls always for the collaboration.
Those are some great points. And I know we're short of time, but the report concludes by saying that banks should not just view digital identity from a business lens, but also should think about its value to society at large. So could you quickly, Kevin and Jukka, tell us about how you think banks can drive positive change in the community through digital identity?
Oh, I can take the first shot, and
Sure.
please, Kevin.
Yeah.
Well, I think that we have seen that the government-led these digital identity schemes do not necessarily cover all the needs, and as said, or if they do quite well, so it takes a long time, and then you need to know your customer needs and create attractive services, as said earlier, and the user experiences, and again, this is not necessarily the strength of the public sector. So this leaves room for somebody else, a trusted partner, a party like banks, to maybe fill this vacuum, but it could be taken, of course, somebody else. But I think that as we already discussed, so banks have the strong trust position. And then if you use this inherited trust that the government issued digital identity gives for the larger population, I think that this enables really and fosters the digital trust, which then contributes also for the bank itself. I mean, if you look from the kind of a little bit from a helicopter point of view, so that you can really build this trusted brand or enhance the trusted brands and importance, then that as you being an actor in a society and responsible actor in the society. So this is maybe the more kind of the high level view. So, but maybe you have, Kevin, good examples of what this could mean in practice too.
Yeah, I think it's kind of a guiding principle that all participants building an identity network or scheme need to consider is the inclusivity of remote communities is a big challenge in Canada. So is broadband, are smartphones available? Do people have constant always on connectivity and unlimited data to use? So a whole bunch of things you can do to that banks are required to do, the business to ensure that everyone can be banked, at least in Canada. That's a law. I think in the US, you would have a harder time arguing that that there's a big unbanked population in the US, and so you have to figure out how to, if you build digital identity around banking login, how do you get the unbanked access to those services? So I think there's a number of things you can do in processes. You always make sure that there's an alternative way to, say, proven identity or provision identity. You can build things to make offline access available so that you don't constantly require broadband internet connection or that sort of thing. So lots of considerations. I think it's one of the principles that we kind of talk about as being important is choice and consent and user experience, minimizing data sharing. Those are the things that we kind of contemplate in the report that are guiding principles that everyone should be thinking about when building these things.
Perfect. So thank you so much for your time, Kevin and Jukka. We've hit time, and I know it's been a great discussion and so much more questions there. But overall, the report really provides a lot of insight into some of the latest trends that are happening in the digital identity space. And as we mentioned, it sheds that spotlight on digital identity wallets. We've got some great results from surveys that we conducted from leading banks across the world. We've also delved a little deep into some of the technical concepts and also roles that banks can play, in addition to use cases of value, as well as a lot of the movement in the big tech, fintech space as well. So a lot of insights for all of you. I really would encourage everyone here on the call today to read the report and spread the word out. The report will be available on Mobi's wall that you've got exclusive access to before the rest of the industry. So looking forward to your feedback and responses after reading the report. But other than that, thank you so much, everyone, for joining. And thank you once again, Kevin and Jukka.
Thank you.
And thanks to you, Ruben, for a great conversation. Appreciate everyone's attendance.
Likewise.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.